Perhaps the most interesting, fascinating, polarizing prospect in this year's NBA draft is the big 7'1" Latvian Kristaps Porzingis. Many people view him as being the second coming of Dirk Nowitzki, view him as that type of stretch four that could be a big-time star at the NBA level, while many others sit there and look at him and see another Euro player with a lacking NBA type of body, who has a perimeter-based game without a clear-cut pure position that would take years to develop and ultimately will join the ranks of guys like Nicholas Gilishvili and Andrea Bargnani and Darko Milicic because he's an international player, of being a bust or at least a disappointing NBA prospect. So there's no question when it comes to the 2015 NBA draft, the prospect that is the most compelling and fascinating to pay attention to is Porzingis because he's going to be the guy that really potentially shakes up that entire lottery in the NBA draft. Now, when it comes to interesting teams pertaining to the NBA draft, I think you got to rank the Philadelphia 76ers right up there at the top of the list. General manager Sam Hinkie has a plan. Doesn't mean it's necessarily the right plan. Doesn't mean that it's a good plan or that he has any clue of what the hell he's doing with this so-called plan. The Sixers have clearly been in tank mode the past couple of seasons and most certainly aren't about to emerge out of that phase of their plan anytime soon. Now you have the 76ers sitting there with the third overall pick in what appears to be a pretty good draft class for a team that desperately needs an impact, big-time player, preferably on the perimeter. There's Kristaps Porzingis, there's the Philadelphia 76ers, and it ultimately begs the question for me, should the Philadelphia 76ers take Kristaps Porzingis, number 3 overall in the 2015 NBA draft? Well, I look at this in terms of how drafting Porzingis would fit into the plan of the 76ers, what their organization is currently about, their philosophy, and then look at some of the other options and see how drafting Porzingis at number 3 would stack up. Now, in terms of the 76ers and their plan, there's no question. They kind of went into Chicago Cubs mode in a way in terms of that they were pretty much going to sit there and say flat out, we're tanking this number of seasons. I don't know if the Sixers have ever defined the number of seasons, but there's no doubt that their whole plan was to tank and to continue to tank because they believe the best way to build a championship team is through the draft, and therefore, as a result, acquiring more premium draft pick currency, trading off players for future draft pick currency considerations, and all the while being able to stay way under the salary cap. So that way, if and when you do start to find those key pieces, those key cogs, those star players, you could be able to re-sign them and still be able to be in a flexible salary cap situation. So if and when that time comes, you're actually a contender and you need to go out and spend some money, you'll be in a position to spend money in great abundance, especially when you look at the potential for the NBA salary cap to raise pretty soon once the new NBA TV deal officially kicks in. So taking a Kristaps Porzingis in many ways would fit that plan. It would allow them to continue to tank because a lot of people perceive Porzingis is not going to be a guy that makes a ton of immediate contribution. As a result, he's going to be a guy that takes time to develop, and I would agree, even though you look at many prospects in this draft, you could probably say the same thing. Looking at a guy like a Porzingis, he's a guy, again, that he could take that time to develop. And all the while, you're not having to go out and spend big money on the market for a guy like him, a stretch type of four, because those guys can be pretty expensive commodities on the market. And you look at it, it kind of fits in some ways the mold of the 76ers in terms of doing things a little bit off of the beaten path. And when you look at a guy like Porzingis, especially if you feel like he's not immediately ready to play 30-plus minutes a night at the NBA level, he really helps you in terms of that tank philosophy. So that way you can give them time to develop. Maybe the next year or two you bring in more marquee pieces and then you're really off to the races. So let's look at the different options that are here for the Philadelphia 76ers. And then I'll kind of give you my thoughts on maybe what they should do. Option number 1 is just to sit there and shut out all the noise, not pay attention to anybody else and their thoughts or their opinions, and watch as Karl Anthony Towns goes number 1 and Jahlil Okafor goes number 2, and just sit there and take Kristaps Porzingis number 3 overall. If Sam Hinkie and the Philadelphia 76ers believe that he is the best player on the board, then that is the guy that they must take no matter what. Now, for some of you that sit there and say, well, that's all fine and good, but they need a point guard. They have to have a point guard, in particular a point guard that can shoot. Yeah, that's great. But when you look at the top point guards in this draft, you look at D'Angelo Russell, in some ways, I'm concerned about that lack of really big-time lateral athleticism and his ability to break down people off of the dribble with his initial quickness, and therefore makes me wonder if he's better off as a combo guard or a two-guard at the NBA level as opposed to a pure point guard. Or is he going to be more of a scoring point guard? And how much is that really going to improve the Sixers long-term? I have questions about that. And then when you look at Mudiay, a guy that seems to be a little bit more physically ready for the NBA in terms of his body, even though they're both, Mudiay and Russell, about 6'5". This is a guy that can beat people off of the dribble, a good athlete, not a phenomenal athlete, but a pretty good athlete, and I think a better overall athlete than D'Angelo Russell, but a guy that can't really shoot. And in this modern NBA, where you're playing so much in the pick and roll, if you have a point guard that can't shoot, then teams are going to sag off and go underneath the pick and roll, and it's going to be much less effective to be able to run that pick and roll. Well, when you've got a guy like Porzingis, you can sit there and be able to run that pick and roll with him. Either him being the one that's creating off of the dribble or being the one sets the screen that can cut to the hoop or can step out and hit the three. And, again, this whole thing about having to have a point guard, well, that's all fine and good. But who's to say in a draft that's pretty good at the point guard position all throughout the first round, maybe there's better value there if you take Porzingis at 3 and then trade back up maybe into the tail end portion around number 1 and get a point guard like a Terry Rozier, a Tyus Jones, a DeLon Wright, somebody like that, as opposed to just taking a guy like a D'Angelo Russell number 3 or an Emmanuel Mudiay number 3, let's say. And in terms of the fit, people are going to talk about the fit of Porzingis. Let's look at it this way. Joel Embiid, he's apparently had a setback with his foot injury. He might not play next season. At this point in time, you can't even count him into the equation long term. You just can't. Nerlens Noel is a combination 4 or 5 guy. He could play the 5 and I think be fine, but he's a role player, a good role player at the NBA level, but he's never going to be an all-star type of player as far as I perceive. So there's an opportunity there for Porzingis at the 4. Some of you are going to point to, well, what about a Dario Saric? Well, what about him? If anything, Saric projects more as a 3 than a 4 at the NBA level, and he might even be a 6-man off of the bench. Furthermore, you're talking about a guy that's at least another year, if not 2 years away from coming to the NBA to play for the Sixers. So Porzingis would fit with the Philadelphia 76ers. There's no question about it. But what other options do they have? They have the option of just drafting D'Angelo Russell, the guard from Ohio State. To me, D'Angelo Russell has all-star potential. Like I've said, at moments I have concerns about whether or not he's a pure point guard at the NBA level. But this is a guy that can score the basketball. This is a guy that can shoot the basketball. This is a guy with incredible floor vision and court vision that can make others around him better. His vision and his passing are outstanding for a 19-year-old. He is a guy, here's the benefit of him, that can play in a variety of systems because while he can play with the ball in his hands a lot, he can also play off of screens. He can play without the ball, move without the basketball. So there's a lot of flexibility and a lot of versatility there in terms of what you could do with D'Angelo Russell in your lineup. And, the whole thing about D'Angelo Russell not being that good on the defensive end, well, LeBron James wasn't a very good defender when he came into the league. Kobe Bryant most certainly wasn't a good defender when he came into the league. Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, they weren't noted for their defense at all when they came into the league. Guys can work on this. Guys can improve upon this. Guys can get better at this. You're not emphasizing it so much at the high school or the college level where their teams need them to be those big-time scorers. The defense is kind of secondary, especially when you could drop back into a 2-3 zone or what have you. And when you look at the fact that you've got somebody like Nerlens Noel patrolling the post, Russell's defense isn't as critically important because you do have a legit rim presence, a shot blocker there in Noel. So if you believe, as I do, that today's game is about the perimeter, it's about the wings, it's about having that point guard, it's about having those type of players, and that's how you build a championship team. And if the Sixers are serious about building a championship team, then D'Angelo Russell would seem to be a logical fit. Now, they have other options too, and these options involve trading down. Maybe they could trade down to number 4 where the Knicks are. because they've made the Knicks fearful that they'll end up taking D'Angelo Russell. The Knicks just have to have D'Angelo Russell. You could trade back a pick, still take a Porzingis, or if you decide to go with a point guard, you can go with Emmanuel Mudiay. And then all the while, what have you allowed yourself to do? Accumulate potentially some additional draft pick currency, whether it be in this draft or in future drafts. So you could still end up with the guy in Porzingis, but instead of taking a number 3, you could trade back a spot and get some additional draft picks. Or option 4, you could trade down to number 5 with Orlando. You've maybe fooled Orlando into thinking that you love Kristaps Porzingis. You've used the smokescreen very effectively. And therefore, as a result, you're able to sit there and get Orlando to jump up to you where you're at from 5 to 3 and be able to get maybe an additional second rounder this year, and most especially at least one future first rounder just to drop back 2 spots to where you might still be able to take a guy like Emmanuel Mudiay, or maybe you have your eyes on somebody like a Justice Winslow. There are a lot of options here for the Philadelphia 76ers. And I imagine a lot of Sixers fans are going to be upset and mad if this team takes Kristaps Porzingis over D'Angelo Russell. I understand it. And I kind of agree with it to a certain level. I like Porzingis as a prospect. To me, he's the 4th best player in this draft. But D'Angelo Russell, to me, is arguably the best player in this draft. If I'm sitting there at number 3, I'm taking D'Angelo Russell, even though it is very tempting and very appealing to take a guy like a Porzingis. Now, however, if I've got a team like Orlando beating down my door, because they want to get up from 5 to 3, and I can get them to part with a future first rounder to move down 2 slots to either get a Emmanuel Mudiay or what have you, then I've got to consider doing that. Or if I've got the Knicks sitting there, knowing the Knicks are probably going to be bad for the next couple of years perhaps, and they want to move up from 4 to 3 in order to get D'Angelo Russell, and I can get Kristaps Porzingis and an additional draft pick or 2, including a future first rounder, I've really got to consider the options. I don't think this is an easy open and shut slam dunk case. For the Philadelphia 76ers fans that say they've just got to take D'Angelo Russell over at number 3, don't overthink it, don't get cute, don't get stupid. I understand it. However, based off of the philosophy and the plan of Sam Hinkie that many Sixers fans choose to defend for reasons that I don't know why, if you stick to the plan, it would actually make more sense for them to try peel back out of that pick 3 to either pick 4 or pick 5 and accumulate some additional draft pick currency and gamble on a guy like Porzingis. Because I might be able to argue, while at this moment I view Russell as the better long-term NBA player, I think Porzingis has a little bit more upside because you're talking about a guy that's 7'1.5", almost 7'2", with a 7.5-foot wingspan that can handle the rock, shoot the 3, is willing to grab rebounds. He's got some attitude to him, and he's only 19 years old, so there's a lot of room for growth. To me, the Sixers should be looking to peel back a little bit and get a guy like Porzingis, or even if they go back to 5, Emmanuel Mudiay. And they got to feel pretty good about that. Or even somebody like a Justice Winslow, who, while not a point guard, I think personally is the 2nd best player in this 2015 NBA draft class. But I want to hear from you. What do you think the 76ers should do? If you're a Sixers fan, would you be okay with them taking Porzingis, even though you know that means they passed on D'Angelo Russell and Emmanuel Mudiay? Would you be okay with them trading back in this draft, knowing that that is part of the 76ers plan? That is kind of their operational strategy, and it would still allow them to get a marquee talent in this draft and potentially set themselves up well in a future draft going forward? Let me know down below. Like I said, for me, if they do take Russell at number 3, I'm most certainly not going to knock him, because I feel kind of silly sitting there and saying, well, this team is stupid for taking Russell when they could have taken Porzingis, when I had Russell a little bit higher as a prospect compared to Porzingis. And they were able to get, in my opinion, the number 1 player on the board at the number 3 overall pick. But at the same point in time, from a Sixers standpoint, I actually think it makes more sense long-term to try and be able to trade back, especially to where Orlando is. If I had to say it all said and done, it's either got to be force the Knicks to move up 1 spot, maybe get a future first rounder out of them. Or, even better, you get the Magic to peel up from 5 to 3. They can take Porzingis, you can take Mudiay, and you're going to get an additional second-round pick this year probably, and maybe 1, if not 2, future first-round picks. So therefore, again, allowing you to continue to tank while at the same time staying way under the salary cap and acquiring some very attractive draft pick currency long-term.